Dreams can appear in the strangest moments. Sometimes they show up in sunshine, wrapped in perfect timing and good luck. But for 12-year-old Sophie Chen, her dream arrived in a downpour at the Silverstone Circuit, clutched in a waterproof folder and protected by 3 layers of plastic. They say you should never meet your heroes. They say most dreams are just that, dreams. But they never saw the determination in Sophie's eyes that rainy day. Never knew that sometimes the biggest changes in life come when everyone else has run for shelter. This is a story about a girl who stood in the rain, a champion who stopped to listen, and how a single moment of kindness turned impossible dreams into reality. The rain at Silverstone Circuit wasn't the gentle kind that makes flowers grow. It was the heavy sort that turns everything gray and sends people running for cover. But 12-year-old Sophie Chen wasn't running anywhere. She stood her ground at the edge of the parking lot, her black hair plastered to her face, holding tight to her waterproof folder. "Miss, you really should head inside," a security guard called out, his yellow jacket bright against the gloomy sky. "The drivers won't be out for hours in this weather." Sophie shook her head, droplets flying from her soaked hair. "I'll wait," she said quietly, but with the kind of determination that meant business. The guard shrugged and walked away, muttering, "Something about stubborn kids." She looked down at her shoes, cheap sneakers from the discount store that were now completely soaked through. Mom had saved 3 weeks to buy them, working extra shifts at both the hospital cafeteria and the convenience store. Sophie wiggled her cold toes, remembering how guilty she'd felt asking for new shoes when her old ones got holes in them. But today wasn't about shoes or rain or being cold. It was about dreams. Inside her folder, protected by 3 layers of plastic, was Sophie's pride and joy. Detailed technical drawings of Lewis Hamilton's Mercedes Formula One car. She'd spent months working on them, studying every photo she could find, reading every article about the car's design, and watching endless videos of pit stops to understand how each part worked together. The parking lot had been full of fans earlier, but the rain had scared most of them away. Now, it was just Sophie, the puddles, and her dreams. She'd begged her mom to let her come today, promising to finish all her homework for the next week in advance. Mom had finally agreed, dropping Sophie off on her way to her cafeteria shift. 1 hour, Mom had said firmly. "Then you come straight home on the bus." That had been 3 hours ago. Sophie's phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably another worried text from Mom. But she couldn't check it now. Her hands were trembling, partly from the cold and partly from excitement. This was her chance, maybe her only chance, to show Lewis Hamilton her ideas. She'd figured something out about the car's design, at least she thought she had. It had started with a math problem in school about air resistance. While other kids had groaned about equations, Sophie had seen something different. She'd noticed how the numbers could help make cars faster, smoother, better. After weeks of calculations and using up 2 whole notebooks, she'd discovered what might be a tiny flaw in the Mercedes car's rear wing design. The rain drummed harder on her shoulders, but Sophie barely noticed. She was lost in thought, running through her explanation one more time. She had to get it right, had to make him understand that she wasn't just some kid with a fan drawing. A group of mechanics hurried past, huddled under umbrellas, giving her odd looks. Sophie stood straighter, trying to look professional despite her dripping clothes. Her mom's voice echoed in her head. "Stand tall, Baobei. You're as good as anyone else." Thunder rumbled overhead, making Sophie jump. She checked her watch. 4:47 p.m. The team would be leaving soon. Her stomach churned with nervous energy. What if Hamilton didn't stop? What if security wouldn't let her show him the drawings? What if he thought her ideas were stupid? She pushed the doubts away, focusing instead on her calculations. The numbers were right. She'd checked them hundreds of times. The way the air moved over the rear wing could be improved by just 2 degrees of adjustment. It might only save milliseconds per lap, but in Formula One, milliseconds meant everything. More rain fell, and Sophie's socks squished uncomfortably in her shoes. She thought about giving up, about catching the next bus home where it was warm and dry. Mom would make her favorite soup, and they could watch old race videos together like they always did on rainy days. But then she remembered the night she'd first told Mom about wanting to be a Formula One engineer. They'd been watching Hamilton win the British Grand Prix, and Sophie had noticed how the car's aerodynamics worked with the track conditions. She'd explained it all to Mom, using chopsticks and napkins to show how the air moved around the car. Mom hadn't laughed or told her to be more realistic. Instead, she'd hugged Sophie tight and said, "Then you'll be the best engineer Formula One has ever seen." After that, Mom had picked up extra shifts to buy Sophie engineering books and old computer parts to practice with. A distant rumble caught Sophie's attention. Not thunder this time, but engines. Her heart jumped into her throat. This was it. Team Mercedes was leaving the track. Several cars rolled past, their headlights cutting through the rain. Sophie held her breath, counting them. 4th in line. That was Hamilton's usual spot in the convoy. Her hands clutched the folder tighter, the plastic crinkling under her fingers. The 4th car appeared through the rain, moving slowly in the wet conditions. Sophie could make out a figure in the back seat, head bent over a phone. This was her moment. She stepped forward, just enough to be visible, but not enough to seem threatening to security. The car was almost level with her now. Sophie's heart pounded so hard she thought it might burst out of her chest. Then, like something from a dream, the car slowed. The back window hummed down, and there he was. Lewis Hamilton, 7-time world champion, looking right at her. Sophie's mouth went dry. All the words she'd practiced disappeared from her brain. "You've been standing out here all this time?" Hamilton's voice was kind, concerned. "In this weather?" Sophie managed a small nod, her hands shaking as she held up her folder. I think I found something," she stammered. "About the rear wing. The airflow. It's not quite—" She trailed off, suddenly aware of how ridiculous this must seem to him. But Hamilton wasn't laughing. He was looking at her with genuine interest. "Hold on," he said, and to Sophie's amazement, the car door opened. A security guard stepped forward, but Hamilton waved him off. "It's all right," he said, opening a large umbrella. "Anyone dedicated enough to stand in this rain deserves a few minutes." He walked over to where Sophie stood, frozen in disbelief. The umbrella covered them both, and for the first time in hours, no rain fell on Sophie's head. "Now then," Hamilton said, smiling warmly, "tell me about this rear wing theory of yours." Sophie took a deep breath, her fingers finding the right page in her folder. As she began to explain, her voice grew stronger. The rain kept falling around them, but in that moment, Sophie Chen felt nothing but sunshine. She didn't know it then, but this rainy day at Silverstone would change her life. Forever! The next 3 years would be full of challenges, setbacks, and moments where giving up seemed like the only option. But standing there in the rain with her hero, showing him her drawings while mechanics and security staff watched in amazement, Sophie took the first step on a path that would lead her right back to this very spot, though in a way she never could have imagined. See this part here? Sophie's finger traced the line of her drawing, leaving a tiny water drop on the page. If you adjust the angle just 2 degrees, The airflow changes completely. Lewis Hamilton leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he studied the detailed sketch. Behind him, two Mercedes engineers had gotten out of their cars to join them, holding umbrellas and whispering to each other as they watched. "And you calculated this yourself?" Hamilton asked, glancing from the drawing to Sophie's face. Sophie nodded, flipping to the next page where her calculations filled the margins. "I used the same formulas we learned in physics class about air resistance, but I added in the speed variables from your qualifying laps." Her voice grew stronger as she explained, forgetting for a moment that she was talking to her hero. "Then I built a small model at home, using my mom's old computer fan to test the airflow." One of the engineers stepped forward, his Mercedes team, jacket gleaming with rain. "May I?" he asked, holding out his hand for the folder. Sophie handed it over carefully, her heart pounding as he flipped through her work. The engineer's eyebrows rose higher with each page. He showed something to his colleague, pointing at Sophie's calculations. They both looked surprised, but not in a bad way. "You did this with a computer fan?" the second engineer asked. "And some cardboard, and my mom's hair dryer," Sophie admitted, feeling her cheeks grow warm despite the cold rain. "I couldn't afford proper testing equipment." Hamilton's expression changed at that, becoming somehow softer and more serious at the same time. "Sometimes the best innovations come from working with what you have," he said. "I started racing in a go-kart my dad bought second-hand." The first engineer was still studying Sophie's drawings. "These calculations, they're actually quite sophisticated. How old are you?" 12, Sophie answered, trying to stand taller. "But I'll be 13 in 2 months." Hamilton chuckled at that, but it was a warm sound, not mocking. "Reminds me of myself at that age, always trying to sound older." He turned to the engineers. "What do you think of her theory?" The engineers exchanged looks. "It's interesting," the first one said carefully. "The basic principle is sound. We'd need to test it properly, of course, but the math checks out at first glance." Sophie's heart felt like it might burst. They weren't dismissing her ideas. She watched as Hamilton took the folder back, studying her drawings one more time. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "most fans who wait in the rain want an autograph or a selfie. But you're different. You're already thinking like an engineer." He handed the folder back to Sophie, then reached up and took off his Mercedes team cap. It was the special edition one from his last championship win. Sophie's eyes widened as he placed it carefully on her head, adjusting it so it wouldn't fall over her eyes. "Keep pushing," Hamilton told her, his voice serious. "This sport needs more minds like yours, more people who see things differently." He glanced at her soaked shoes, then back to her face. "And more people willing to stand in the rain for what they believe in." One of the security guards stepped closer, checking his watch. They'd been talking for almost 15 minutes. Hamilton nodded, understanding it was time to go. "Thank you for showing me your work," he said to Sophie. "Keep developing that idea. Who knows? Maybe one day you'll be the one making our cars faster." Sophie clutched her folder to her chest, barely trusting herself to speak. "Thank you," she managed to whisper. Hamilton started to turn away, then paused. "What's your name?" "Sophie. Sophie Chen." He smiled. "Remember this moment, Sophie Chen. Sometimes the rain brings unexpected blessings." With that, he walked back to his car, the engineers following after giving Sophie one last curious look. She stood watching as the convoy of Mercedes vehicles pulled away, their taillights glowing red through the rain. Only when the last car disappeared did Sophie realize she was shivering. Her phone buzzed again. Mom would be really worried by now. But first, she carefully touched the cap on her head, making sure it was real. The security guard who'd tried to send her away earlier walked over, shaking his head in amazement. "Never seen anything like that," he said. 15 minutes. He usually doesn't stop at all after practice sessions. Sophie barely heard him. Her mind was already racing ahead, thinking about how she could improve her designs. She had to prove Hamilton right. Had to show him and everyone else that this wasn't just a lucky moment in the rain. As she finally turned to leave, Sophie noticed something strange. A woman in a Mercedes team jacket had been watching from a distance, taking notes on a tablet. When she saw Sophie looking, the woman smiled and disappeared into a nearby building. On the bus ride home, still dripping water onto the seat, Sophie made a promise to herself. She would become more than just the girl Hamilton met in the rain. She would work harder than anyone else, learn everything she could, and someday, somehow, she would make it back to Silverstone. Not as a fan standing in the rain, but as something more. Her phone buzzed one more time. Opening it, Sophie saw 15 missed calls from Mom. She quickly hit dial, knowing she was in for a lecture about staying out in the rain. But as the phone rang, Sophie smiled, touching the cap again. Some lectures were worth it. She didn't notice the email that arrived just then. A message from an unnamed Mercedes account that simply read, "Talent spotted." Subject, Chen, Sophie. Status, monitoring. The rain kept falling outside the bus window, but Sophie didn't mind anymore. After all, sometimes the rain brings unexpected blessings. 1 year later, Sophie Chen, if you don't get your racing books off the dinner table right now, we're going to be eating on your bed of technical drawings. Sophie looked up from her physics textbook, blinking as if waking from a dream. Her mom stood in their tiny kitchen, holding 2 steaming bowls of noodles and wearing her tired but amused expression. "Sorry, Mom?" Sophie scrambled to clear the table, carefully stacking her books and papers. Hamilton's Mercedes cap, watched from its place of honor on the shelf above, now accompanied by a growing collection of engineering awards and science fair ribbons. The wall beside Sophie's desk had transformed over the past year into what she called her mission board. News clippings about Formula One innovations shared space with her own designs and calculations. In the center hung her prized possession, a printed photo of her with Hamilton in the rain, signed with the words, "Keep pushing the limits, LH." Mom set down the noodles and studied Sophie's latest drawings. "More improvements for Hamilton's car?" Sophie shook her head, slurping up some noodles. "Not just his car anymore. I'm working on something new." She pulled out her tablet, showing her mother a 3D model she'd created. "See how the air moves differently. Here, I think this could work for any F1 car, not just the Mercedes." "My little engineer," Mom said softly, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind Sophie's ear. "You know, your teacher called today." Sophie froze mid-slurp. "Is this about the thing in math class? You mean when you corrected Mr. Patterson about aerodynamic calculations?" Mom's eyes twinkled. "Yes, that thing. He wants to move you up to advanced placement classes." "Really?" Sophie's chopsticks clattered onto the table. "But those are for older kids." "Those are for students who are ready for them," Mom corrected. "He thinks you could handle the work." She paused, stirring her noodles. "It would mean extra classes after school. I'd have to change my shifts at the hospital to pick you up later." Sophie started to protest, but Mom held up a hand. "Don't you dare feel guilty about that. I can adjust my schedule. The real question is, do you want to do this?" Through the thin walls of their apartment, they could hear the neighbor's TV playing highlights from the latest Grand Prix. Sophie closed her eyes, remembering the rain at Silverstone, the way Hamilton, and the engineers had looked at her work with real interest. "Yes," she said firmly. "I want to do it." Mom smiled, reaching for her phone. "Then I'll call the school tomorrow." She paused, looking at Sophie carefully. "There's something else. I've been saving a little money each week." She pulled up a website on her phone and showed it to Sophie. It was an advertisement for a basic coding course. "Your teacher mentioned that many F1 engineers need programming skills. It's not much, but—" Sophie threw her arms around her mother, nearly knocking over the noodle bowls. "Thank you. Thank you. Thank you." Later that night, Sophie sat at her desk, her new coding tutorial glowing on the screen. The neighbor's TV was quiet now, replaced by the soft whir of the fan she used for testing her aerodynamic models. She'd rebuilt it 3 times since that day at Silverstone, each version more precise than the last. Opening her email, Sophie started her weekly update to the Mercedes F1 team. She'd been sending them regularly since meeting Hamilton, sharing her latest ideas and improvements. Most went unanswered, but occasionally she'd get a brief response thanking her for her interest. What Sophie didn't know was that each email was being carefully archived by that same mysterious figure who'd watched her in the rain. Each design, each calculation, each improvement was noted and evaluated. As midnight approached, Sophie's phone lit up with a notification. The Formula One website had posted an article about upcoming regulation changes. She clicked it eagerly, already thinking about how the new rules might affect her designs. The article mentioned something that made her sit up straight. Teams would be required to improve fuel efficiency by 15% within 2 years. Sophie's mind raced. She'd been working on an idea about reducing drag that could help with that. Pulling out her notebook, she started sketching. Mom had already gone to bed after her long hospital shift, but Sophie couldn't sleep. Not when she had an idea burning in her mind. Hours passed as she worked, testing calculations and running simulations on her second-hand laptop. The screen flickered occasionally. It was getting old, but Sophie barely noticed. She was lost in the world of physics and aerodynamics, of wind tunnels and drag coefficients. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Sophie finally sat back, rubbing her tired eyes. Her new design was rough, but she thought it could work. It would need more testing, more calculations, more refinement. A soft knock at her door made her jump. Mom stood there in her nurse's uniform, ready for her early shift. "Have you been up all night?" she asked. Though her tone suggested she already knew the answer, Sophie nodded sheepishly. "I had an idea about the new regulations. Look." She held up her drawings excitedly. Mom walked over, looking at the complex diagrams and equations that covered Sophie's desk. She couldn't understand most of it, but she recognized the passion in her daughter's eyes, the same look she'd had standing in the rain at Silverstone. "You know what this means, right?" Mom said, picking up one of the drawings. "No sleeping in on Saturday. You need rest to keep that brilliant brain working." Sophie grinned. "I promise I'll sleep this weekend, after I finish the coding tutorial. And maybe after I run a few more tests." Mom shook her head, but she was smiling. "Sometimes I think Hamilton created a monster that day," she said, kissing Sophie's forehead. "But a monster I'm very proud of." As Mom left for work, Sophie turned back to her designs. Her wall of inspiration had grown so much in the past year, covered now with complex technical drawings and mathematical formulas. But her eyes found Hamilton's cap, still sitting where she could always see it. "Keep pushing the limits," she whispered to herself, touching the simulation program she'd started coding. It was basic, and probably full of errors, but it was a start. Just like that first drawing in the rain had been a start. Her computer pinged. Another Formula One news alert. But this one was different. Sophie's heart skipped a beat as she read the headline, Mercedes F1 announces new youth engineering program. The mysterious observer's email from a year ago suddenly felt more significant. Sophie didn't know it yet, but her path back to Silverstone was about to take an unexpected turn. 2 years after the rain. The garage was hot and stuffy, smelling of oil and rubber. Sophie wiped sweat from her forehead, leaving a dark smudge as she stared at the engine in front of her. Mr. Rodriguez, the garage owner, watched as she traced the fuel line with her finger. "Well?" he asked, arms crossed. "What's wrong with it?" Sophie bit her lip, remembering everything she'd learned in the past 6 months working at Rodriguez Auto Repair after school. The engine wasn't just a car part anymore. It was a puzzle of physics and fluid dynamics, just like her F1 designs. "The fuel isn't flowing efficiently," she said finally. "See how this line is slightly bent? It's creating resistance, making the engine work harder than it needs to." Mr. Rodriguez's weathered face broke into a smile. "Very good, Chica. Now, how do we fix it?" As Sophie explained the solution, her phone buzzed in her pocket. Probably another notification about Mercedes's youth engineering program. She'd been obsessively checking the application requirements since its announcement 3 months ago. The program was revolutionary, offering young people between 14 and 16 the chance to work with real F1 engineers. Sophie would turn 14 just 2 weeks before the application deadline. It felt like destiny. But destiny, she was learning, didn't make things easy. "Sophie!" Mr. Rodriguez's voice snapped her back to attention. "Less daydreaming, more fixing. Cars don't repair themselves." "Sorry, sir." Sophie turned back to the engine, but her mind kept wandering to the partially completed application on her computer at home. The program required advanced coding skills, something she was still struggling to master despite hours of practice. After finishing at the garage, Sophie rushed to catch her bus home. Her coding tutorial website was open on her phone before she even sat down. She had 2 hours before Mom got home from her hospital shift, 2 hours to make her latest program work. The bus lurched around a corner, and Sophie nearly dropped her phone as a new email arrived. Her heart jumped when she saw the sender. Mercedes F1 Team. "Dear Ms. Chen," it began, "thank you for your continued interest in Formula One engineering. Your recent design submission regarding fuel efficiency has been reviewed." Sophie held her breath, but the next line made her heart sink. "While we appreciate your enthusiasm, the technical requirements for our youth engineering program are quite specific. Candidates must demonstrate proficiency in C++ programming and advanced CAD software." The rest of the email blurred as tears threatened to form. Sophie blinked them back hard. She wouldn't cry. Not here. Not now. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Jason Zhang, the only other person in her advanced math class who cared about racing. "Did you see the latest post about the program?" his text read. "They're looking for people who can code real racing simulations. That's way beyond basic stuff." Sophie's fingers hovered over her phone. Jason didn't know about her meeting with Hamilton. She hadn't told anyone at school. They already thought she was strange enough, always talking about aerodynamics and engine efficiency. "I'm still applying," she typed back. "I'll learn whatever I need to learn." Jason's response was quick. "You know they only accept like 5 people, right? And most of them probably have engineers for parents. Not." He stopped typing, but Sophie knew what he meant. Not a single mom working hospital shifts. Not a girl learning from YouTube videos and second-hand books. At home, Sophie found a note from Mom on the kitchen table. "Working late shift. Dinner in fridge. Love you." Next to the note was a small package. Sophie opened it to find a used programming textbook, C++ for beginners. A sticky note inside read, Found this at the hospital book sale. Chase Those Dreams, Bao Bei. Sophie hugged the book to her chest, feeling the familiar mix of love and guilt. Mom was working so hard, picking up extra shifts to support her dreams. And now, with the program's requirements seeming impossible, her eyes drifted to Hamilton's cap on her shelf. "Keep pushing the limits," she whispered to herself. Walking to her desk, she opened her laptop and started a new design. If she couldn't match their programming requirements yet, she'd make her engineering ideas so brilliant they couldn't ignore her. Hours passed as Sophie worked. Her dinner sat forgotten in the fridge as she refined her calculations, cross-referencing them with real race data. When the numbers didn't work, she started over. When her simulation crashed, she debugged it line by line. The neighbor's TV blared. Through the wall, another F1 race replay. Sophie heard the commentators discussing Hamilton's latest victory. "It's all about adaptation," Hamilton was saying in the post-race interview. "The track conditions change, the car changes, you have to keep adjusting." Sophie sat up straighter. That was it. Her simulation was too rigid. She needed to make it adaptable, like a real F1 car responding to changing conditions. As she began rewriting the code, her phone lit up with a news alert. Technical Director Sandra Mitchell joins Mercedes Youth Engineering Program Selection Committee. Sophie froze. Sandra Mitchell wasn't just any technical director. She was the woman Sophie had seen taking notes that rainy day at Silverstone. The same one who'd sent that cryptic, talent-spotted email. With trembling fingers, Sophie opened her email and found Mitchell's public contact information. Before she could talk herself out of it, she began typing. "Dear Ms. Mitchell, you may not remember me, but 2 years ago, I was the girl in the rain at Silverstone." She worked on the email for hours, explaining how that day had changed her life, how she'd been studying and improving ever since. She attached her latest designs, her simulation attempts, everything she had. At 3 a.m., her mother found her asleep at her desk, head resting on her keyboard. Mom gently draped a blanket over her shoulders, noticing the unsent email on the screen. She read it, tears forming in her eyes at Sophie's words. "I know I'm not the most qualified candidate. I know my programming skills aren't where they need to be yet. But 2 years ago, Mr. Hamilton took a chance on a girl standing in the rain. I'm asking for that same chance now." Mom reached over and pressed send before turning off the desk lamp. What neither of them knew was that across town, in the British headquarters of Mercedes F1, Sandra Mitchell was already reviewing Sophie's file. On her tablet was a folder labeled Project Rain, containing every email, every design, every improvement Sophie had sent over the past 2 years. Mitchell smiled, adding a note to the file. "Subject continues to exceed expectations. Proceed to Phase 2. In her bed, Sophie dreamed of rain and racing, of engines and code, of impossible dreams that somehow didn't seem so impossible anymore. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, new moments of doubt. But for now, she slept, unaware that her email was already being read, unaware that her journey back to Silverstone had just shifted into high gear. The response came 3 days later. Sophie was in the garage, helping Mr. Rodriguez with a transmission repair, when her phone buzzed. She almost dropped her wrench when she saw the sender. Sandra Mitchell, Technical Director. "Take 5, Chica," Mr. Rodriguez said, noticing her shaking hands. "Some things are more important than transmissions." Sophie retreated to the small break room, her heart pounding as she opened the email. "Dear Sophie Chen, I remember the rain quite well. Your persistence is noted. Your potential is clear. But potential alone isn't enough in Formula One. Attached is a technical challenge. You have 48 hours. Good luck, SM. The attachment was a zip file containing specifications for a Formula One front wing design. At the bottom was a note. Find the flaw. Fix it. Show your work. Sophie's hands trembled as she downloaded the files. This wasn't just any technical challenge. It was a real F1 component, probably from a previous season. This was her chance. She rushed home after work, barely greeting Mom as she ran to her room. Her laptop hummed to life, screen filling with complex technical drawings and aerodynamic data. Everything okay? Mom appeared in the doorway, still in her hospital scrubs. Sophie explained about the email, about the challenge, about the 48-hour deadline. I have to get this right, Mom. I just have to. Mom studied the technical drawings on the screen. When was the last time you ate? Sophie couldn't remember. I'll make you some dumplings. Brain food. Mom squeezed her shoulder. You've got this, Baobei. Hour after hour, Sophie pored over the design. The front wing was incredibly complex, with multiple elements working together to manage airflow. She checked and double-checked every measurement, every angle, every curve. Around midnight, her phone lit up with a text from Jason. Hey, did you get a technical challenge too? This thing is impossible. Sophie's heart skipped. So she wasn't the only one. This must be the next phase of the selection process. Working on it, she replied. How's it going? I give up, came the response. My dad's an engineer, and even he says it's too advanced. They must have sent these to the wrong group. No way a kid could solve this. Sophie looked at Hamilton's cap on her AD shelf, remembering what he'd said in the rain. Sometimes the best innovations come from working with what you have. She turned back to her screen with renewed determination. She might not have an engineer parent or expensive software, but she had something else. 2 years of studying every detail of F1 aerodynamics, plus months of hands-on experience with real engines. The hours blurred together. Mom brought dumplings, then breakfast, then more dumplings. Sophie barely noticed, lost in the world of computational fluid dynamics and pressure coefficients. Then, 20 hours into the challenge, she saw it. The flaw wasn't in the measurements or the materials. It wasn't even in the main wing elements. It was in the transition point where air moved from the front wing to the underfloor. A tiny detail that would only matter at very specific speeds. Mom! Sophie shouted. Mom! I found it! She explained. Her discovery, hands waving excitedly as she described how the airflow would become turbulent at exactly the wrong moment. Mom didn't understand the technical details, but she understood the joy in her daughter's eyes. Now comes the hard part, Sophie said, turning back to her computer. I have to fix it. The next 20 hours were a blur of calculations, simulations, and revisions. Sophie's basic programming skills were pushed to their limits as she modeled her solution. When her old laptop crashed, she rebuilt her calculations by hand, covering her desk with papers full of equations. Mr. Rodriguez let her use the garage's computer during her break to run more powerful simulations. Even Jason, who had given up on his own challenge, came by to help her debug some code. With 1 hour left on the deadline, Sophie finally sat back, exhausted but satisfied. Her solution was simple but elegant. A small modification to the wing's transition point that would maintain laminar flow at all speeds. She'd tested it against every race condition she could think of. Her finger hovered over the send button. What if she was wrong? What if she'd missed something obvious? What if... Stop doubting yourself. Sophie turned to find Mom in the doorway again, holding a fresh cup of tea. But what if? No what ifs, Mom said firmly. You did your best. That's all anyone can do. She smiled. Besides, Hamilton didn't stop in the rain that day because he felt sorry for you. He stopped because he saw something special. Sophie took a deep breath and clicked, "Send." A moment later, her phone buzzed with an automatic reply. Submission received. Thank you for your participation in the technical challenge phase of the Mercedes F1 Youth Engineering Program selection. Process. Results will be communicated within 72 hours. 3 days. She had to wait 3 more days. Sophie tried to keep busy. She worked extra hours at the garage, tackled harder coding problems, even cleaned her room. But her phone never left her sight. On the morning of the 3rd day, she woke to find Mom sitting on the edge of her bed, holding an envelope with the Mercedes F1 logo. It came by courier, Mom said softly. Special delivery. Sophie's hands shook as she opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 lines of text. Technical challenge assessment. Past next phase. In-person interview location. Mercedes F1 headquarters, Brackley. Below that was a handwritten note in familiar handwriting. Rain was just the beginning. SM. Sophie looked up at her mother, tears streaming down her face. They weren't tears of joy or sadness, but something in between. The overwhelming emotion of a dream slowly, impossibly, becoming real. What she didn't know was that in Brackley, Sandra Mitchell was already preparing for her arrival. On Mitchell's desk sat a thick folder labeled Project Rain Final Phase, and paper-clipped to the front was a faded photograph of a young girl standing in the rain at Silverstone, holding a folder of drawings that would change her life forever. The Mercedes F1 headquarters in Brackley looked nothing like Sophie had imagined. Instead of a single building, it was a sprawling campus of sleek structures, each one gleaming in the morning sun. Security gates and cameras monitored every entrance, while team personnel hurried between buildings wearing their Mercedes uniforms. "Your pass, miss?" the security guard asked. Sophie handed over the visitor badge she'd received in the mail, trying to keep her hands from shaking. Mom gave her shoulder a squeeze. "I can't go past this point with you, Baobe," she said softly. "But remember, you've earned this moment, no matter what happens in there." Sophie hugged her mother tightly, breathing in the familiar scent of hospital antiseptic mixed with Mom's jasmine perfume. Then, squaring her shoulders, she followed a young woman in Mercedes team gear through the security gate. "I'm Emily," the woman said as they walked. "I'll be your guide today. First stop is the technical assessment room. Then you'll have a series of interviews. Try to relax. Everyone's nervous on interview day." Sophie wanted to ask about Sandra Mitchell, about Project Rain, about the technical challenge she'd solved, but before she could form the words, Emily was opening a door marked Technical Assessment Suite 3. Inside, 3 other teenagers sat at workstations, each facing a computer screen. Sophie recognized Jason from the nervous way he was tapping his foot. The other 2 she didn't know. A tall girl with bright red hair and a boy wearing what looked like a very expensive watch. "Take Station 4, Emily said, pointing to the last computer. "Instructions will appear on your screen in 2 minutes. Good luck." As Sophie sat down, she noticed something odd. Her workstation was slightly different from the others. The screen resolution wasn't as sharp. The keyboard had a few worn keys, and the mouse was exactly like the one she used at home. Before she could think about what that meant, the screens lit up with their first task. Design a pit stop procedure for a new wheel locking mechanism. Consider safety, speed, and reliability. You have 45 minutes. Sophie's heart raced. She'd studied every pit stop video she could find over the past 2 years. She'd even built a model of the wheel gun mechanism using parts from Mr. Rodriguez's garage. Her fingers flew over the keyboard as she worked, creating diagrams and writing code for the safety protocols. The worn keys felt familiar, comfortable, just like working at home. Time blurred as they moved through more challenges. Each one seemed perfectly crafted to test not just their technical knowledge, but their practical understanding of racing. 2 hours later, Emily returned. Technical assessment complete. Time for your individual interviews. One by one, the other candidates were called away. Jason went first, returning 20 minutes later, looking pale. They asked about engine thermal dynamics, he whispered as he passed Sophie. Good luck, you'll need it. But as the morning wore on, Sophie wasn't called. The red-haired girl went next, then the boy with the expensive watch. Both returned looking stressed. Still, Sophie waited. Finally, Emily appeared again. Sophie Chen, follow me, please. Instead of the interview rooms where the others had gone, Emily led Sophie through a maze of corridors to a different building, entirely. The sign on the door read, Advanced Projects Division. Wait here, Emily said, gesturing to a chair. Director Mitchell will be with you shortly. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. Sandra Mitchell herself? The woman who'd been watching. Her progress for 2 years? The minutes crawled by. Sophie studied every detail of the waiting area. The F1 trophies in glass cases, the technical drawings framed on walls, the constant hum of activity from nearby rooms. Then a door opened and Sandra Mitchell stepped out. She looked exactly as Sophie remembered from that rainy day. Tall, sharp-eyed, carrying a tablet. But now she was smiling. Hello, Sophie, she said warmly. I think we're overdue for a proper meeting, don't you? The office Sophie entered was unlike anything she'd expected. One wall was covered in technical drawings, and with a start, Sophie recognized some of them as her own designs from the past 2 years. Another wall displayed a timeline labeled Project Rain, with photos, notes, and data points spanning the time since that day at Silverstone. Please, sit, Mitchell said, gesturing to a chair. I imagine you have questions. Sophie had thousands, but what came out was the computer in the assessment room. It was set up like mine on purpose, wasn't it? Mitchell's smile widened. Very observant. Yes, we wanted to see how you'd perform with familiar tools. You see, Sophie, we've been watching your progress since the day Lewis Hamilton stopped in the rain. Not just your technical skills, but how you developed them with limited resources. She pulled up a file on her tablet. You turned a computer fan and hairdryer into a wind tunnel. You learned complex physics concepts from YouTube videos. You got a job at a garage to understand engines firsthand. Mitchell looked up. That kind of determination and creativity is rare and valuable. But Sophie struggled to understand. The youth program requirements, the advanced coding, the CAD software were deliberately set above your current level, Mitchell finished. We needed to see how you'd respond to seemingly impossible challenges. Would you give up, like your friend Jason? Or would you find another way? Sophie's mind raced, pieces falling into place. The technical challenge, the front wing design, that wasn't just any test, was it? No, Mitchell said softly. It was the same flaw you identified in your very first drawings, the ones you showed Hamilton that day. We'd already fixed it, of course, but we wanted to see if you could find it. Again, this time with 2 years more knowledge. She stood, walking to the timeline wall. Project Rain was created to identify and nurture raw talent. Young minds who could see problems differently, who could innovate with whatever resources they had. The youth program was just a cover, a way to watch candidates develop naturally. Sophie's heart pounded. How many candidates are there? Just one. Mitchell turned back to her. You, Sophie. It's always been you. The room seemed to spin. But I'm not ready. My coding skills can be taught, Mitchell said firmly. What can't be taught is your way of thinking, your dedication, your ability to see solutions others miss. She paused. That's why we're not offering you a place in the youth program. Sophie's heart sank, but Mitchell wasn't finished. We're offering you something else, a full apprenticeship with the Advanced Projects Division, with all the training you need, plus a scholarship for your continued education. She smiled. Your mother already has the paperwork. My mother? She knows? We met with her last week. She drove a hard bargain for your education fund, by the way. Tears blurred Sophie's vision. All those extra hospital shifts, Mom had known this was coming, had helped make it happen. Mitchell handed her a tissue. There's one more person you should talk to before you decide. She pressed a button on her desk phone. Send him in. The door opened, and Sophie's heart stopped as Lewis Hamilton walked in, holding a familiar Mercedes cap. Hello again, Sophie, he said, smiling. I believe we have some unfinished business to discuss about that rear wing design of yours 3 months later. The Silverstone circuit looked different in the sunshine. Sophie stood in the Mercedes garage, watching mechanics prepare Hamilton's car for the British Grand Prix. Her own Mercedes team shirt still felt new and stiff, the apprentice badge gleaming on her chest. Ready for your first race weekend? Sandra Mitchell asked, appearing beside her. Sophie nodded, clutching her tablet with its Advanced Projects Division logo. 3 months of intensive training had taught her more than she'd learned in the past 2 years combined. Her coding skills had improved dramatically, and she now understood the complex software that controlled every aspect of the car. But nothing had prepared her for this moment, being back where it all began, this time on the other side of the garage wall. Lewis wants to go over the new cooling system data, Mitchell said. Think you can handle the presentation? Sophie's hands trembled slightly as she pulled up the graphs she'd prepared. The cooling system modifications had been her first major project. She'd spent weeks perfecting the design, using everything she'd learned from her makeshift wind tunnel experiments at home. Hamilton was already in his race suit when she approached, studying the car's telemetry data on a screen. Ms. Chen, he said formally, then broke into a warm smile. Sorry, Sophie, old habits. Show me what you've got. As Sophie explained her modifications, she felt the same excitement she'd had that rainy day, showing him her drawings. But now, her ideas were backed by proper simulations, wind tunnel tests, and real data. See how the airflow changes here? She pointed to a particular graph. It's similar to what I noticed in those first designs I showed you, but now I understand the fluid dynamics much better. Hamilton studied the data carefully. This could give us an advantage in the high-speed corners. He looked at Mitchell. When can we implement it? Already done, Mitchell said. Sophie's design was installed last night. All the simulations, check out. Sophie's heart skipped. Her design was actually on the car that would race tomorrow, the car that millions of people would watch. Well then, Hamilton said, putting on his helmet, let's see what it can do. The next hour was a blur of practice laps and data analysis. Sophie's hands flew over her keyboard, monitoring the cooling system's performance. Every time Hamilton took Copse Corner at full speed, she held her breath, watching the temperature readings. It worked perfectly. The car stayed cooler, allowing Hamilton to push harder through the high-speed sections. When he finally returned to the garage, his smile said everything. Nice work, Sophie, he said, removing his helmet. I think we're ready for qualifying. As the team prepared for the next session, Sophie stepped outside the garage for a moment. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the track. In the distance, she could see the spot where she'd stood in the rain 2 years ago. A movement caught her eye. A young girl, maybe 10 years old, was standing by the fence, watching the garage activity with wide eyes. She held what looked like a notebook. Sophie walked over to her. "Hi there, I'm Sophie. What's your name?" "Maria," the girl said shyly. I like engineering. I want to work with racing cars someday." Sophie smiled, remembering herself at that age. "Can I see your notebook?" Maria hesitated, then opened it to show complex drawings of engine parts, each carefully labeled with notes and questions. "These are really good," Sophie said, meaning it. "You know, I started just like this." She told Maria about standing in the rain, about never giving up, about how dreams sometimes take unexpected paths to come true. As she spoke, she noticed Sandra Mitchell watching from the garage, a knowing smile on her face. "Sophie!" Hamilton's voice called from inside. "Qualifying in 30 minutes. We need you." "Coming!" she called back. Then she turned to Maria. "Wait here." Sophie jogged to the Mercedes hospitality area, returning with a team cap, her old one, the one Hamilton had given her that rainy day. "Keep pushing the limits," she told Maria, placing the cap on her head. "Maybe I'll see you in the garage someday." Back inside, the team was busy with final preparations. Hamilton was in his usual pre-qualifying routine, but he paused when Sophie returned. "Passing on the tradition?" he asked, having seen her with Maria. Sophie nodded. It felt right. Hamilton's expression grew serious. "You know, Sandra told me about that day before I stopped. Said she'd been watching you through the garage, cameras, saw your determination. She's the one who suggested I might want to take a look at your drawings." "Really?" Sophie had never known this part of the story. "Really? But what I saw in those drawings, what I saw in you, that was all real. Sandra might have pointed you out, but you earned every step of this journey yourself." The garage speakers crackled. 15 minutes to qualifying. Hamilton put on his helmet, then paused. Ready to help make some history? Sophie took her position at the engineering station, fingers hovering over the keyboard. 2 years ago, she'd been a girl in the rain with a dream. Now she was living that dream, helping design the very cars she'd once drawn in her notebook. "Ready," she said firmly. As Hamilton's car roared to life, Sophie felt a different kind of rain, tears of joy rolling down her cheeks. She wiped them away quickly. Engineers didn't cry in the garage, after all. But later that night, after Hamilton had secured pole position with help from a certain cooling system, Sophie stood alone on the track. The circuit lights cast a gentle glow, and a light drizzle had begun to fall. She held out her hand, letting the raindrops fall on her palm. Each drop seemed to hold a memory. The long nights studying, Mom's endless support, Mr. Rodriguez's lessons in the garage, Mitchell's secret observations, and that first life-changing moment with Hamilton. Her phone buzzed, a message from Mom. "Proud of you, Baobei. Your dreams were always bigger than the rain." Sophie smiled, looking up at the dark sky. The rain had brought her here, but it wasn't an ending. It was just the beginning. Tomorrow would be her first real Grand Prix as part of the team. There would be more challenges, more problems to solve, more innovations to create. But for now, she stood in the gentle rain at Silverstone, no longer a girl with a dream, but a young woman living one. And somewhere in the Mercedes garage, in Sandra Mitchell's office, a photograph was being added to the Project Rain timeline. It showed 2 figures by the fence, a young apprentice engineer sharing her story, and a little girl with dreams as big as the sky. The circle was complete. The rain had blessed another dreamer, and Sophie Chen, the girl who once stood alone in a downpour, had found her way home. Thank you for sharing this journey with Sophie Chen, from that rainy day at Silverstone to her dream becoming reality. Stories like these remind us that with enough determination, even the most impossible dreams can come true. I'd love to know, where are you following Sophie's story from? Whether you're chasing your own dreams in Tokyo or tuning in from Toronto, drop your location in the comments below. Every comment helps this story reach more dreamers around the world. If Sophie's journey touched your heart, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We share inspiring true stories like this every week, each one carefully crafted to remind us that extraordinary moments can happen to ordinary people. Until our next story, keep pushing your limits. You never know when your rainy day will turn into sunshine.